3, 4. Here we go. Good evening. Welcome to lesson 7 of CE3372 Water Systems Design, Fall 2020. On the screen, I'm on the Blackboard Learning Management System. There's strange noises coming from my neighbor's house. Oh, ice chests. I guess they're getting ready to enjoy tomorrow. I hope everyone had a great day so far, and I will do my best to ruin that for you. Not just kidding. This lesson is based on this morning, about an hour and 10 minutes. So we won't have to use the entire time today, which is good on my hard disk drive, managing the memory. And the topic is storage and storage principles, and primarily drinking water systems. Before going to that, I want to go to the home page of our Blackboard account. And yours probably looks something like this. And just let you know that in the quiz collection category, there are 2 new quizzes, pipeline head losses and pump curves. They're both due next Monday, so you have the weekend plus the rest of this week. I don't think they're that difficult, but again, I'm not the one who has to take them, so maybe that's not a fair assessment. They're not particularly long, and they should help reinforce the idea in each of these. When you do the quizzes, I would suggest that you don't try to rush through them, but put some thought into them and allocate some time, because both of them have some aspects that are computational in the sense that you will make a better guess at the correct answer if you have take some time to compute what the question's asking. If you're a really good guesser, you might be able to get it by just picking guesses. And that's all I have to say about that. Let's return to the home page. And I will go to our lesson collection. And today is lesson 7. And it's all queued up, and all this is a link to the class content server. And we move our pictures down and out of the way. So this is really going to clutter things up. Let's see what happens. I will turn off the enter-exit chime so you don't have to hear it. I've been having difficulty with my network all day, and since this morning. I had AT&T, I believe a contractor was doing some work, and they cut a cable at about 2:46 in the afternoon. So this is restored service, so it's clearly running quite slow right now. Painfully slow, in fact. On the off chance that that's already, okay, so that's already connected to it, and check that my wireless is working. It is. So that link is supposed to take us here. For some reason, it's stalled. And this lesson is storage principles for service, fire, and emergency storage components. And an examination to look at pictures of different kinds of storage tanks and some example calculations for flow equalization storage. In the content server, there is a spreadsheet. I wonder if the server itself is clobbered. Apologize, I'm going to take a briefly do something different to be sure that it's actually up and running. Okay, it's up. What else could be wrong? The web server needs to be restarted. That's not expected. And God, that was weird. All right, everybody, it seems to, I wouldn't say it resolved itself, but I have it working again, I think. So let me turn back on the screen sharing. And that's the page we're supposed to be at. I'm still not sure if this is coming from the cache or if it's actually accessing the server. One way to find out is when we go to lesson notes. Let's go to something we haven't visited, so we'll take that link. It goes to YouTube, as it should. I'm going to assume it's going to work, and let me continue with the lesson from where I left off. I've got some editing to do. So for those of you that care, and maybe none of you, so this is my DNS service, which routes the request to Atomic Kitty to the computer in my house. And for some reason it wasn't working. They claim I have an open invoice, but I'm paid through October, so that shouldn't be why they would deny service. And they refuse to accept both my credit cards, so I have a feeling there's something going on their end. And then they're claiming I don't have dynamic updates, when in fact these were done 10 minutes ago. So this may be the end of the lesson today, but let's see what happens. In data links, I'll get that out of the way. In data links, there are some spreadsheets, and we'll visit this spreadsheet later on. And the supplemental data is an example that is implemented in that spreadsheet. There's some readings, but the most useful one is water distribution systems in the Land Development Handbook, and a particular reading that's currently not linked. Words 130 to 198 in the later part of that document. So that seemingly fast download means it was already on my computer. And I'm going to the back part of that reading section. And they have a few pages on storage, particularly elevated storage tanks, and some guidance there. So this is a good reading also. And we'll visit it again in a few lessons when we get to the actual network simulation part. And so now let's move forward to the actual notes. So the first part discusses storage and why it's used. So it's used in water supply, stormwater management, and wastewater systems for a variety of reasons. Much of what I'm going to present in the next few minutes is applicable to all three categories, with one important exception. We're usually unwilling to pay the energy cost to elevate stormwater or wastewater. And the thought of storing wastewater in an elevated storage tank is just icky. So that doesn't happen. But at grade and below ground are both commonly used in stormwater and wastewater. So the categories of storage that we'll discuss are service storage, emergency storage, and fire storage. Service storage, its main purpose is for maintenance of pressure zones and flow equalization. And flow equalization is fancy terminology for things that are designed for a particular steady flow rate, and we use storage to accommodate the variable demand in the system over the course of a day or over a few days. Emergency storage is exactly what it sounds like. It's water that's set aside to provide supply when we have to shut other parts of the system off and still need to deliver water, so during repairs and if there's other system failures. So, for instance, perhaps you've traveled around either Lubbock or wherever you're from, and occasionally a water main will break and there'll be water bubbling up in the street. Well, it takes some time from when the water bubbles up in the street to when the public calls the municipality to when they can schedule a work crew to go out there and figure out what's wrong and then actually repair it. And during that time, we want to have our system be able to still deliver water even if the water is being wasted down the street, so as to not require us to have to disinfect the whole thing. And that's what emergency storage is for. The last category, fire storage, is water that's set aside and stored always, all the time, in the event we have to supply water during a firefighting activity. Logically, it could be considered part of emergency storage, but usually it's treated as a separate component or as a subcomponent of emergency. The storage itself is either elevated, above grade, up in the air, elevated storage tanks, suitable for painting the names of your community, your high school football team, or the name of the nearby airport. At grade, these are also large tanks or reservoirs, not easily for painting the name of your community on it that anyone can see, or below grade subsurface vaults, but not aquifers. So a surface reservoir, as depicted here in the cartoon, is a large tank in this cartoon located up partway up a hillside, or it could be at the top of the hill if you actually own the top of the hill. And the demand center in this particular cartoon is down the hill a bit. And the total head that tank can provide, at least momentarily, is the distance from the regular pool elevation to the demand center elevation. So these are a desirable feature if your particular design situation can support it, meaning you have hills that you can acquire property rights to. because the actual delivery from that tank to wherever we want to put it is by gravity. We still have to put water in the tank. We would do that with pumps, but we have a nice hydraulic air gap, if you will, that separates the supply side to get water into that reservoir and the demand side that takes water out of the reservoir. They allow us to take advantage of smaller pumps and operating the pumps at odd hours of the day when electricity is cheaper and presumably when water is more available. They're usually covered for protection from contamination, growth of stuff makes it taste bad, evaporation. As an example, a few years back, why protection of a reservoir is important. There were some high school kids out in the Portland, Oregon area. It seems like Portland's in the news a lot lately. And they were out hanging by the local water supply reservoir and thought it would be just a grand idea to urinate in the reservoir. Well, 5 or 6 high school kids, after drinking a few cases of beer, really doesn't present much, if any, of a public health issue peeing in the reservoir, because there's an awful lot of dilution going on, and it's going to be treated anyway, although it was a treated water reservoir. Unfortunately, the municipal agency chose to waste several million gallons of water and then refill it so as to not contaminate their drinking water system with high school boy pee. It sounds kind of funny now. It was an overreaction on the part of that water distribution system, and something that could have been entirely avoided with the use of a cyclone fence and robotic armed guards. Protection so that they couldn't actually access the water. So seemingly stupid stuff like that is an important consideration for any kind of designs. A second type of water storage device is a standpipe, and you can think of it as a tank whose height is greater than the diameter. And in the case of those high school football kids, they would have had to climb up to this thing, do their business. Assuming alcohol was involved, which it probably was, they would have fallen in, and then there would be bodies that would get in the way and really make the water nasty. I'm just kidding. So these tend to be fairly tall compared to their diameter, and they have a design feature that we implement as the designer. If we have a particular amount of pressure head that we want the system to always have, that establishes the pool elevation for the minimum desired pressure head. And the amount of water in storage at that pool elevation is called the supporting storage. And then any storage above that is the useful or the operational storage. These are fairly common and fairly easy to build. In addition, this supporting storage, in the event of an emergency, can actually be drawn into. It can be used for that. And there's a fair amount of structural consideration, because down here at the bottom of the tank, it has to be able to support the outward pressure of all this water on top of it. So if that's 100 feet of water, that's about 3 atmospheres. So there's 45 or 50 pounds per square inch at the bottom pushing out, which doesn't sound like much, but when you multiply it by, imagine the bottom 6 inches of that, you multiply that half a foot by whatever the diameter is times pi, and you got a pretty substantial area. There's a lot of force down here. One of the desirable features is all the weight force pushing downward is completely supported by the foundation. It's just pushing into the ground. Now the next variation of the standpipe would be for the designer to recognize there's an awful lot of supporting storage if its whole purpose is to maintain pressure head. Why don't we make everything below the minimum desired pressure head level kind of narrow, and then we'll keep the useful storage big and wide. And that is what gets us the composite elevated tank. So still looks like a standpipe, but the operational storage is up here in the flying saucers. So these aren't really storage tanks. They're actually alien spacecraft waiting to go back to the mothership, put on these pillars so they don't have as far to go out to outer space. No, just kidding. These pillars, as shown here, now the pillars aren't entirely filled with water. This is generally just a shell around the structural elements that hold up the tank, and then certainly there is some hydraulic infrastructure inside this shell to bring water up into the tank and to draw it down into the system. And the shapes vary from these disc-like shapes to these ellipsoidal shapes. It's really whatever the designer wants and the community wants and what's ever available by the fabricators. If you want to just buy these things already built, there's a company called Hydropillar, which semi-prefabricates these things. And you'll notice they all have some common design elements. They have a tank up in the air that is essentially a truncated cone, a vertical part, and then another truncated cone. And then they have a support pillar, which provides the structural support and the hydraulic infrastructure to bring water to and from the tank. And then inside this structural support, there's a lot of usable space. So in the photograph in the upper right picture, we see they're using this space to store, looks like fire trucks, painted white so that in the wintertime you can see them coming easier. And then here's another Hydropillar, has some buttresses on it to help support the weight of the tank. I imagine this thing is actually quite huge. And then there is, it looks almost like glass lights to let light into the interior. So on the inside, there's something else going on in there. Perhaps the rest of the city water department stores itself there. And the Hydropillars, the tanks themselves come in a lot of, in several different shapes. So here's one that doesn't look unlike these examples here, but was constructed in such a way that you can have exterior aesthetics with these little waves right here and bubbles. Those are the fish blowing air bubbles, because everyone knows fish breathe air. And this one has a clock on it in homage to the Rolling Stones that lets you know that time is on their side. It's also time to conserve. And like most elevated storage tanks, they usually paint the name of their community. This is a premier community, not one of those rerun communities, or the name of their high school football team. Here's another one that I presume is located near an airport in Jefferson County, Alabama, so that as you're landing your airplane, you can look down at this storage tank, which hopefully you've missed, and realize where you're landing, and then perhaps that you have picked the wrong airport. And then here's one that looks kind of like a coffee cup without the handle on it for a place called Mineral Point. All of the Hydropillar. Another common design is these ellipsoid or spherical or almost spherical tanks that are held up on a relatively narrow column. And so this is taking the standpipe concept to a logical extreme, where the standpipe part is pretty narrow. So this distance from the bottom of the structure to the bottom part of the spheroid is providing the support storage or the pressure, and then the working storage is in the elliptical tank above it. And again, like most cases, either the name of your local outdoor sporting goods store, or the name of the favorite confection, York, or the name of the community, Linwood, is put up here, or the name of the high school football team. There is some aesthetics conferred by these. If you want, you can make the tank look like a peach. So here's an example of one that is disguised to look like a peach. That's pretty tricky because as you're driving through the community, you wouldn't recognize that as a water tank. What you do is you see a giant peach in the air. And presumably this community has something to do with peaches. And then here's one that doesn't have anything on it other than this white paint. So that's begging for the community to put their name on it, or some energetic youth will find a way up there with spray cans and decorate it on behalf of the community. This photograph here is a standpipe, and these two on the left, on the right, my other left, these two on the right are ground level storage tank or ground level reservoirs. So recall the difference between a standpipe and a ground level tank is that standpipes have a diameter smaller than the height. Ground level tank, the opposite is true. These are still pretty high. You wouldn't want to fall off the top. It would cause broken bones, or possibly you would cease to exist. But they scale pretty easy, and these can be quite huge. Hundreds of feet in diameter. It actually really depends on the skill of the fabricator and the soil conditions on how big these can be made. At some point, they get too big to actually make as tanks, and then they just become holes in the ground with a waterproof liner, like the South Water Plant here in Lubbock has a fairly large tank. From the ground, it looks like a big it's a big berm of piled up dirt, and if you go up to the top of the berm, which you shouldn't be able to access except without permission, they actually brought in cyclone fencing, mostly to keep floating bodies out of it. When you get to the top and you look down, it's actually a gigantic bermed hole in the ground, if you will, lined with a geotextile to make it waterproof, that serves as the storage tank for water that's served in Lubbock. Here's some other photographs. Here on the right, tropical looking. These are at-grade storage tanks. Looks like it's the city of Westminster, and these are correctly identified as water facilities. Here on the left is a fairly substantial at-grade storage tank. It kind of looks like Fredericksburg, but I didn't take the picture, so I don't know. And then here is a standpipe at Woodhaven Lakes, again, suitably taking the canvas of the outside to advertise their community. And then there's a few different methods to try to circulate the water in the tank. So these store a lot of water, and water can spend a fair amount of time inside the tank. And when it's in it, we want to mix it so that the water is fresh, or more importantly, that the disinfection residual is uniformly distributed throughout the tank. If that weren't the case, there are portions where the water will tend to stagnate. It'll be there a long time, and it'll get yucky tasting. So this particular example is something called the fresh mix standpipe mixing, and there's simply a draft tube and probably a low shear propeller pump that just circulates water inside the tank, and probably a fairly low energy setup. I think you might be able to achieve this kind of mixing with thermal convection, but that wouldn't be very reliable. So there's some kind of a mixing system in it, and that's if the water is already treated. If it's raw water, there would be occasional mixing that you would do to stir up all the gunk and sediment and get it out of the system, and then it goes through treatment. As an example of the kinds of capacities that can be achieved, Elevated storage tanks can be pretty large in diameter. Here's one that's specified at 118 feet in diameter. That's bigger than airplane size, with a operating head range of 45 feet. So you got 100 foot in diameter and almost 50 feet tall of tank. Now it's going to be either a spheroid or a truncated cone, like in this picture on the right. And they can be stuck up as high as 60 feet in the air. So in addition to the hydraulic volume that's capable, there's quite a bit of structural component involved in elevated storage tanks. And the building of these things is still ongoing. So this isn't some quaint historical tour through storage tanks. So the photograph of this one is in Far, Texas. It was, in 2014 when it was proposed. And the reason I bring this picture up is this tank that's pictured here. That was designed by my wife, and so it's been very good for the Cleveland family that people need water. So this particular storage tank is relatively new, less than 6 years old, and I'm not positive what the orientation of the photograph is, but I think west is in the background, so this is looking west and perhaps a little south towards Mexico. And Far, Texas isn't terribly far from Mexico. Probably within 2 miles of where this tank stands is the nation of Mexico. So that gives you an idea where this is located down on the border. And the border communities need water also, just like the rest of us. The last type of tank I want to discuss in this first part of the lesson is an underground tank. So underground is desirable because it's kind of underground out of the way, but it has to perform a couple of roles, and like an elevated storage tank, an underground tank has a substantial structural component. So this circle of bricks in this intersection in San Francisco covers up an underground called cisterns storage tank. And so the storage cisterns in San Francisco are intended primarily for firefighting, and the secondary is emergency storage in case there's an earthquake that breaks the main water supply. And assuming the pipes exiting these tanks haven't been destroyed by that earthquake, there is still usable water supply, and it's entirely gravity flow. So obviously this underground storage tank can't flow water uphill to just past that house, which is where I grew up in San Francisco. But underneath is a substantial cavern. And that cavern has to not only hold water, so it's got to be watertight, it also has to resist the soil forces that are trying to crush it, and the traffic load and the overburden forces on top that are trying to flatten it like a pancake. So what the designers did in this case is it's a steel tank, and the roof of the tank, which is underneath this pavement, has a cylindrical shell. So whoever designed it read their Timoshenko book on plates and shells and specified a tank made out of a shell with certain curvature. And this curvature is probably pretty close, either an ellipse or a catenary curve. And what it does is all the surface forces pushing down are redirected by the shell to this outer edge, which can be reinforced with extra steel to keep it from crushing. Even though it's probably relatively safe, I wouldn't want to be this dude down here, ever. I'm not too into underground. Here is a rain storage vault, and the pictures don't look alike, but they actually have a whole lot in common. This one's just a hole in the ground filled with these plastic milk crate looking things. The purpose of these milk crate looking things is to have a lot of porosity so they can store water, but also be able to transfer loads from the surface down to the soil beneath them. So you can think of these as thousands of little columns all holding up soil above them and letting water flow in between them. And so this is a particular brand name of this type of structure, and there's other brands that provide it. And then to get water out of this underground vault is this white structure here is a pump sump, and so a pump is lowered down in here semi-permanently, and then this is all backfilled with soil after being covered with geotextile, and so stormwater can come in here, fill it up, and then the pump can be used to drain it again for the next storm. And the Dallas Area Rapid Transit System has several of these underground stormwater vaults at some of their larger stations in the DART system. So whether you know it or not, if you're from the Dallas area and never ridden DART, you've probably walked on top of one of these. Moving along, we've already to some extent discussed types of reservoirs. We have listed the purpose of reservoirs, and now we're going to get on to calculating storage requirements. So we're going to look at equalization storage. And its purpose is to allow us to use a constant pumping rate to keep reservoirs full instead of having to adjust pumping rates to meet instantaneous demands. What that does is it allows us to use a smaller pump that's either has a lower capital cost or lower operational cost and run the pump all the time, rather than have a large pump that you turn on and off a lot. The storage is also to provide storage for peak demand and system pressure without booster pumping. We'll discuss a little bit about fire and emergency pressures, and we've already seen the three types of reservoirs: surface, standpipes, elevated tanks, and I would go so far as to say rarely are underground vaults used for equalization flows. But they could be, I suppose. So this graphic depicts the three main compartments or categories of storage: service, emergency, and fire. And I've stacked these in such a way that the service storage is intended to go up and down during the course of a day. Emergency and fire are held in reserve as much as possible. We can draw into the emergency storage if we're doing work on the water system and need to turn some things off for a while. And we only draw into the fire storage if there's an actual fire. Now obviously the thing's completely full when there's a fire, and the water doesn't know what compartment it's supposed to be in. This is a human construct on how to apportion the various volumes in the storage system. Flow equalization storage, as a rule of thumb, its purpose is to provide enough volume to account for peak demands in the system without having to exceed supply capacity. And by that, let's suppose we have a pump that can deliver 200 gallons a minute indefinitely. We might have a peak demand at some point during the day in excess of 200 gallons per minute, and if the only way to supply that was to pump it into the system, then we would have to have a pump that could produce more than 200 gallons a minute to satisfy that demand. But if we just run that pump into a storage tank and we store the water when the demand is less than 200 gallons per minute, And when we have a demand greater than 200 gallons per minute, we draw it out of storage. And then we get a system that has flow equalization capability. So we should be able to satisfy any demand. It's kind of like a bank account where you keep some money in the bank so that once a month there's a large supply goes into your bank account, and then you draw from it during the rest of the month, and then the next month the supply comes in again and you draw from it. The bank account is the storage vessel, and whatever amount of money you can afford to keep there all the time would be your flow equalization storage. Now, water, unlike bank accounts, can't go to negative storage. It doesn't make sense, at least not in this context. And then bank accounts have infinite storage of money because they don't care how much you get on the upper end. Once you get big enough, they'll take it from you and say they lost it. Just kidding. Fire storage is the storage that we set aside to be able to meet substantial fire flow. And the desirable volume for that is based on the expected fire flow rates and the required fire flow duration, and that's often prescribed by statute. Emergency storage is a volume that's set aside to allow the system to operate without external supply sources for a period of time for repairs and other unusual circumstances. If we don't have sufficient emergency storage, then every time something goes wrong, it's likely we will contaminate our distribution system and have to lead to a boil water order and then a substantial expense in disinfecting the system. In a well-engineered and operated system, these should be quite rare. I mean, they can happen during hurricanes and earthquakes and maybe fires. Fires that burn the whole city down, not an ordinary city fire that the fire department can put out. And in those kinds of instances, last thing you're worried about is whether you have to do a boil water or not. You just want the system to survive so you can bring it back to service. A desirable volume for emergency storage, as a rule of thumb, would be 1 to 2 days of average daily demand. So then the question goes, how much should we really set aside? The engineering argument would tend to choose for whatever the larger volumes that we can get the owner to pay for. Because the more storage tanks are easy to build. So the more storage we have, the more resiliency and flexibility our built-out system will have. But the owner isn't going to want to pay for water that's not going to go through a meter and generate revenue. So economics tends to argue for the smaller volumes, and in practice it's a balancing act between these competing choices in the design. Some minimum storages are often specified by statute, so that's at least a lower support on the sizing. And then on the engineering one, wanting to get it as big as possible, I mean, there's certainly an upper practical limit. So it would be absurd to store 100 days of water supply to serve a 10-customer community. I mean, it'd be nice to, but that would be a ridiculous use of financial resources. So another thing to guide us is to consider that the water can't sit around in that tank for too long. If the water's treated, so it's been treated to presumably a drinking water standard, so it's potable water, then when we treat it, we create a disinfection residual. But if that's left in a tank for too long, that residual decays over time, and it will decay below a statutory limit on what the minimum residual would be, which would mean the water has to be treated again. Now, arguably, treated water that's gone bad in this context would certainly be easier to treat again than starting with raw water. But that's an added complexity for a system. If we're using chlorine, chloramine, that category of disinfection chemistry, then the time that it can be stored is on the order of 6 to 10 days. Beyond 10 days, it loses enough disinfection residual such that it would not be considered microbiologically safe for distribution. It could be just fine, but that's unlikely. So as a good rule of thumb, the hydraulic retention time of any such reservoir should be no longer than 8 days. I would say 7, but 8 sounds good too. The advantage of a week-long retention time is that gives enough time to respond to problems. Most modern water systems for larger communities, Lubbock is an example, operate their system semi-autonomously. So the Lubbock system, the South Treatment Plant, is computer controlled over the weekends. There's nobody there, or maybe one operator there. There's more plant than there is people to operate it. So the computers are pretty good. Over the years, we've involved pretty good feedback control system, and short of a hardware failure of something, it's pretty unlikely that the system would fail over a 2-day weekend when it's unoccupied by operations personnel. So but what the computer can do is, if it gets into a situation that the algorithm isn't designed to handle, they can do an elegant shutdown, and then send an alert to the operators. Well, if that comes on a Saturday morning, and they have 3 days of usable storage, they can make the logical labor utilization decision to tell the regular Monday crew that your first order of business is to restore service because these certain faults have been identified by the computer. And you'd probably put extra people in, but you would do it during their regular work period instead of having to pay overtime. And that's an important consideration in operations. So these are considerations that need to enter also into the initial design. Hydraulic retention time is defined as the ratio of storage volume to average discharge through the reservoir. It's shown by this equation. HRT is the acronym for hydraulic retention time, and the volume of the tank divided by the flow rate. If you look at the units of that, tank volumes are in a length cubed, flow rates are length cubed over time, and if you divide length cubed by length cubed over time, what you have left is time. So it is indeed a characteristic time that represents the average behavior on how long something would stay in that tank. There's going to be corners of the tank where materials stay a lot longer, and there's going to be other portions of the tank where they spend less time. But on average, the hydraulic retention time is a good averaging value for how long water stays in the tank. So how do we go ahead and size these things? So we're going to look at some of the calculations for determining operating storage or flow equalization storage. The steps are to either determine or obtain the hourly demand for the particular design day. So one thing we could do is use average demand and then use a curve that adapts for each hour of that day. Then calculate the cumulative draft, or how much has to be drawn from the reservoir over that 24-hour period, and then plot that cumulative draft versus time, and then draw a diagonal line representing constant pumping, and the required storage is the sum of the two maximum deviations. So that's all nice and good in words. Let's see a picture. And so here's a graphical representation of what was just stated. So here we have a day running from midnight to midnight. Noon is in the middle, and 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m., midnight. And at the beginning of the day, the demand is at some rate, and as we're moving over time, we're accumulating the volume that has to be supplied to satisfy the demand. And in this particular curve, about 6 in the morning, the slope changes, and it stays steeper until 07 or 8-ish at night, and then flattens out again. And at midnight, we would have required 3.75 million gallons to satisfy this demand curve. If we go from 0 up here to the 3.75 and draw a straight line, that straight line represents a constant draw from supply that gets to the same end point. On that straight line, we see that up until a little bit after noon, we have more supply available than demand. And then after noon, we have more demand than the constant rate of supply. So in the case of the afternoon, we would need to draw from storage. In the case of the morning here, we'd be adding to storage. And so the design guideline is to take the maximum deviation when supply is bigger than demand, and the maximum deviation when demand is bigger than supply. Add those two together, and if we build a storage tank that has that volume, then it should never run dry. We'll always be able to keep water in the tank and still satisfy our demand. It may be, however, that we don't have 24 hours to pump into that tank. And so we can pick different time intervals. For instance, this one is depicting that we only have electricity for our pump station from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. Same general concept. We look at the two maximum deviations between supply and demand. The maximum when demand is bigger than supply and when supply is bigger than demand, add the two together, and that gives us our required flow equalization storage. And we'll go visit this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is depicting the same information. And what we do is we organize time on one axis, and we keep elapsed time after midnight, and these hourly demand requirements, and then the cumulative demand. And so the way to read this is if we look at the cumulative demand column, at the end of the first hour, so at 1 a.m., we would have needed to supply 142,000 gallons of water to the system. At the end of the second hour, we needed to supply the 142,000 gallons of water plus about another 130,000 gallons per water for a total of 277,000 gallons of water. And we continue these calculations all the way to the end of the day. So in this example, the demand is almost 7.4 million gallons. If we were to operate a pump, if we had the ability to pump into our storage tank at 5,110 gallons per minute, that would produce a uniform supply, the solid line here, at the end of the 24-hour period of the same 7.4 million gallons. And then we tabulate the difference between demand and supply over the course of the pumping period. and then we get the largest positive value and the largest negative value, algebraically combine the absolute values of each for a required storage, in this case, of 1.3 million gallons. So if we had a 1.3 million gallon tank under this demand scenario, we would have more than sufficient storage to satisfy the hourly demands with that tank. We also, again, like I said, we don't have to stick with the 24-hour period. We might only operate for 12 hours, and we would look at the effects of that. And so the only difference is actually the times that are considered. The same logic is implemented to get the two deviations, add them together. And so if we only can pump for 12 hours from 6 in the morning to 6 at night, in this particular example, we need 2.7 million gallons of storage. And then if we looked at 6 at night to 6 in the morning, you'll notice the table here has changed, the way the times are organized. We would need almost 4.6 million gallons, more than half of the total cumulative demand for a day would have to be stored. And you can see why from this diagram. Because we're pumping from 6 at night this isn't plotted quite correctly. It should go from time after 8 p.m. I see. So once the pump stopped and we filled the tank, then all of that cumulative demand has to be satisfied or drawn out of storage. And that's why the tank would have to be so large. So in doing flow equalization, we need to decide which demand that we want to use. Do we want to use daily or peak or some combination of the two? The computed volume gets added to that we allocate for emergency and fire flow, and that ultimately determines the tank volume that's required. Once we know what the tank volume requirement is, then we can choose a tank type. So if we also need to provide pressure, that could be an elevated tank. And if it's too big, we might have to put in multiple tanks. Once the tank type is selected and we know the volume, then whether it's elevated, at grade, or buried determines the shape and the elevation and diameter of the tank, the minimum and maximum operating levels. Just as an end note, elevated tanks have a fairly substantial structural component involved, which isn't to say that you should avoid them because you can't do structural engineering, but that you need to allocate enough time in the design, in the detailed design, to do the structural considerations for an elevated tank. That's a little beyond the scope of this class, but I mention it that it's not trivial. Before we go to this, let's go take a look at that example spreadsheet, because it will be instructive. So this is the same spreadsheet that was used to make the figures. Too big. We'll go back to. I wonder if 175 is an option. Oh, it is. Excellent. So here's the example spreadsheet, and so we obtain this hourly demand from an external source, something like this. If we have the average hourly demand rates in gallons per minute for a municipal system, we can try to find the uniform pumping rate and required storage volume, and then we can repeat 4 different pumping schemes. So that's where this column came from. We either did it ourselves or it was provided to us by the client. And if we look at the formula line as we scroll through, we see these are just numerical values. So those are input data, if you will. The cumulative demand is computed by taking the cumulative cell above it and adding to that the hourly demand multiplied by 60 minutes, which is the amount of minutes in an hour, to get the total of gallons that has to be supplied at the end of that hour. So at the end of the first hour at 1 a.m., we need to have supplied 71,100 gallons. At the end of the second hour at 2 a.m., we need to have supplied 71,100 gallons plus another almost 70,000 gallons for a combined total of 138,660 gallons. And for the next hour, we have the 138,660, and we add to that 822 gallons per minute times 60 minutes for a net total of 187,980 gallons, and so on. And that's how we populate this column. And at the end of the design day, at the end of the day, we need 3.7 million gallons. In this next column, this is the uniform supply that we're going to put into the tank, which right now simply exists as a fig Newton of our imagination. You see, if we supply a flow rate of 2,555.25 gallons per minute, we get to a total of 3.7 million gallons at the end of our 24-hour interval. If we make this different, do 2 gallons per minute, we don't produce very much water. Notice the plot pretty much flatlined. And so the last part is to compute the storage volume. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to calculate a difference between supply and demand, tabulate that, and then find the 2 biggest values, the biggest positive and the biggest negative. So we'll go ahead and take supply minus demand. And if we look at that and we look down through the column, we'll see that that is the biggest positive value. And that's the biggest negative value. And then we add the biggest positive to the absolute value of the biggest negative for a total storage requirement of 667,000 gallons. So that's for a That's for a 24-hour drawdown. If we use the same data and we start at 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., we can copy the same logic. Oops. And the total required is now 1.3 million gallons. Here we have the largest negative the largest positive deviation to make those calculations. And we're now also pumping at a different rate. So we have to change the pumping rate to reflect the shorter pumping time. And that's displayed graphically. The key thing on the uniform supply is that that point and that point should be the same value on the y-axis. And the last example, starting from 6 p.m. going to 6 a.m. Okay, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Good, this is the right picture. See, this is time after 6 p.m. in hours. We will copy the same logic. And this place, it computes the storage volume as 1.13 million. Actually, a little bit less than the 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. value. That's kind of interesting. I think that this is supposed to be 2.3 million down here. There's a mistake in this spreadsheet. I think if I copy that same logic, boy, I hope this works. Yeah, that's what I thought. So we need 2.3 million gallons. There's no negative deviation in this case, so that zeroes out. So in this case, we need 2.3 million gallons. In this case, we need 1.3 million gallons. And if we have 24 hours to pump, 600,000. And that's a representative example of how flow equalization calculations are accomplished. There's more in the readings on this subject, and I will. Well, that was a mistake. I will refer you to those if you want to learn more. Now we'll go to the last part, and then we'll be done. We're also going to have to use these in computer models. And the computer models have similar minimum data requirements. What we need to know for a hydraulic model is the bottom elevation of the node that the tank is connected to, the minimum pool elevation, usually in feet above that bottom elevation, the beginning pool elevation, usually in feet above the bottom elevation, and the maximum pool elevation in feet above the bottom elevation, and then some information about the tank dimensions. Usually it's diameter, so they're usually treated as cylinders for initial design, or if we have a good idea of the actual geometry of the tank, a depth storage curve. Kind of like reservoir routing in hydrology, for example. So here is a diagram depicting those kind of information. So node number 2 is the node that the tank is connected to, and it has an elevation of 180 feet in this picture. And then the minimum level of the tank is specified as 300 feet, or actually 120 feet above the elevation, depends on the software. You have to read which is which. The maximum level is 315 feet. Most commercial software will check that the connection from the tank to the node has lengths that make sense. And so the length of this connection has to be at least 120 feet, or it will usually issue a warning and stop calculating, saying that the conduit connecting tank 1 to node 2 is too short. As designers of real design or the hydraulic model design, we certainly have flexibility in these and can use that to our advantage in producing hydraulic models. What this slide is the same thing, but the diameter of the tank can be replaced by a volume versus depth table. We'll see more of this when we get into the EPANet software later on in the course. Sorry I have to rush, but our time is up. Apologize for the 10 to 15 minute delay while I tried to regain control of my web server. Looks like I did. So if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and wish you all a good evening. Thank you for your patience and attention. And I hope you have a great evening and a great day tomorrow and a great rest of the week. And then my usual sign-off warnings. Stay safe. Don't breathe on anybody. Don't get breathed on. And try not to do your best not to get sick and follow the various guidelines for public health. And as I said before, we're going to remind you that until you're sick of it. You're probably sick of it already. If there are no questions, then I will go ahead.
I have a quick question.
Excellent.
For the exercise 3 on the fire flow demand, do we just use the minimum value based on the design book, or
yes.
Is there another way that you want us to calculate that?
What you'll do is the design guideline tells you the spacing fire hydrants have to have, plus some special stuff for cul-de-sacs. And so what you use that to find out how many fire hydrants you need for that neighborhood. Let's say I don't know what the number is, let's say it's 18. And I believe the spacing in the San Marcos manual is 500 feet. And that's a pretty considerable distance, so it's pretty unlikely that a fire department could put more than 2 hydrants in service at any one fire. They don't carry that much hose. So the next statement you would make as the designer is design it under the logical assumption that at most 2 hydrants are involved in any major fire, and with the stated, I believe it's 1,000 gallons a minute for San Marcos, that means we have 2,000 gallons a minute for fire flow. The San Marcos one also tells you how long that has to be. It's not explicit, but it's hidden away in there. And I think it's for 2 hours, but I don't recall. So you know you need 2,000 gallons a minute, plus whatever the regular demand is, for 2 hours. So 2,000 gallons a minute times 60 minutes gives you how many per hour times 2 is the total volume you would need for that system if you were to supply storage. And you may not need storage there, but that gives you your fire flow. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, excellent. Okay, again, thank you very much for your attention. Have a good evening, and I'm going to shut the thing down now. Okay, goodbye.